the 5 competitive forces that shape strategy. Okay, so this is basically Michael Porter's 5 forces. The curriculum has organized this in 6 sections: introduction, forces that shape competition. So these are the 5 forces that you need to know very well. Then what are some factors which people often confuse for forces? So we need to understand what are these factors. How do these forces impact, so when there are changes in industry structure, what's happening with these forces, what are the implications for strategy, and then finally competition and value. Okay, so first some basic introductory remarks. When we historically or traditionally when we talk about competition, we are typically simply looking at established industry rivals. So if somebody is analyzing the cement industry, for example, they might just look at the existing competitors or the players in the cement industry. The way Michael Porter revolutionized this area of strategy is he said you should look at the existing players, but you need to look at additional forces. And effectively, what he said is, in addition to these existing players, you should also look at the threat of new entrants, because they are going to impact the industry and profitability. You also need to look at the bargaining power of suppliers, the bargaining power of buyers, bargaining power of suppliers, and the threat of substitutes. So this reading effectively is going into the details of each one of these 5 forces. And the reason these forces are so important is that these forces have a major impact on profitability. Okay, the simplistic or the visual way of understanding this is, let's say that the profitability of an industry is right here in the middle. Now, if you have a major pressure coming from, say, buyers and customers, what is that going to do to the profitability of this industry? It's going to squeeze the profitability. So understanding the power of these other forces helps you gauge the profitability of an industry. Okay, I just found this graphic very useful. So Michael Porter and his team looked at the return on invested capital. So return on invested capital is a proxy for profitability. So the money that you invest, what sort of a return you are getting. So he looked at a whole bunch of different industries between, say, 1992 and 2006, and tried to gauge which are the most profitable industries, which are the least profitable industries, and tried to explain this in the context of the 5 forces. So just to give you a rough idea, what you see here, I don't know if this is still the case, but at least until 2006, it's funny that this is in a CFA book, but security brokers and security dealers, most profitable. Okay, soft drinks, pre-packaged software, pharmaceuticals. So these are the most profitable business, implying that the forces are weak here. Whereas the least profitable business is airlines, which means that potentially the forces are very strong. So let's pick the least profitable, airlines. So this is out of the curriculum. So consider commercial aviation. It's one of the least profitable industries because all the 5 forces are strong. The established rivals compete intensely on price. This is a US context, but it could be seen in other parts of the world. So in the US context, you have airlines such as United, Northwest, Delta, etc. So they compete intensely. The customers are fickle, searching for the best deal regardless of carrier. So a customer is not tied to a given carrier, so he'll just look for the best deal. So customers, so this is buyer power. The suppliers, who are the suppliers to this industry? Basically, there's Boeing and Airbus. So 2 big suppliers, they have a lot of power. So the airline industry is being squeezed by the suppliers. For some strange reason, even though this is not a profitable industry, you constantly have new players. You know, like many years ago, you had Southwest and others just keep coming into this industry. So you have new players. And then you have substitutes. If you want to go from New York to Boston, you can take a plane, but you can also take a train. You can also drive your own car. So all the forces are strong. Since the forces are strong, the profitability of this industry is low. So you will often hear people say that it doesn't make any sense to invest in airline stocks. So that's just a high-level illustration. We'll be getting into more detail. Another is an application of this whole model is that you position your company where the forces are the weakest. Now again, this is a US-centric model, and I have actually worked with some of the companies here in the US that are in the truck business. So in the US, companies that make trucks, there are some big companies like Mack Trucks, Volvo Trucks, and so on. Okay, so most of these truck companies, they manufacture trucks and sell them to big customers. Okay, the issue here is that the big customers or the buyers have a lot of power. So those buyers can squeeze Mack and Volvo and other truck makers and reduce their profit margins. Okay, so in this industry, one of the companies called PACCAR, okay, I'm not sure if the name is mentioned over here, but there is this company called PACCAR which is in the same industry. What it did is it repositioned itself. Rather than selling to large suppliers, this company said that we are going to sell to people, to individuals who like to buy trucks. So they created these kinds of trucks with nice leather seats, and as in this is a cultural thing, but in the US there are people who might actually practically live out of their trucks. So they can create these big trucks with living rooms, with TVs and a small bathroom and whatnot, all in the truck. So PACCAR started targeting that segment, and to target that segment was not as price conscious. So they could increase the price and hence increase their profitability. So they recognized the industry they are in and repositioned themselves to become more profitable. Okay, so these are quick illustrations, and now we'll get into the details. A few general remarks about this reading. This is probably the most well-known reading in business school. So anybody who's done an MBA and either directly or indirectly taken a course on strategy will have seen this reading. Okay, if you haven't seen this, then I'd question the MBA program that you've been at. Okay, so a general point is that this reading is not just targeted to investment professionals, it's targeted to everyone. So anybody who thinks about strategy, anybody who thinks about running a company will do this reading. Okay, so the question then is, why are we as potential financial analysts going through this reading or being forced to do this reading? The answer is that we can see which companies are successfully or intelligently dealing with these forces, and then those companies become better investments. So that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is you will typically invest in industries that will be profitable. Okay, so all else equal, when you do a top-down analysis, one part of the analysis is an industry analysis. So you are, obviously it's logical to invest in industries that are more likely to be profitable. Which industries are more likely to be profitable? Industries where these forces are weak. So this becomes a component of your industry analysis, even if you are a security analyst. So those are the reasons why we are doing this. Even though the practically 99% of the flavor of this reading is not addressing analysts, it's just addressing a general corporate strategy person. Okay, so forces that shape competition. Now, everything so far was an overview. Let's get a little deeper. The strongest competitive force or forces determining the profitability of an industry and determine the profitability of an industry and become the most important to strategy formulation. The most salient force, however, is not always obvious. A larger point here is that if you have 5 forces, you need to figure out which is the strongest force, and that is the force that is impacting profitability. But the problem is it's not obvious what that strongest force is. For example, even though rivalry is often fierce in commodity industries, it may not be the factor limiting profitability. Low returns in the photographic film industry, for instance, are the result of a superior substitute product. as Kodak and Fuji, the world's leading producers of photographic film, learned with the advent of digital photography. So when digital photography was just making its way into this industry, you had Fuji and Kodak, the two major suppliers of film. Okay, so intense rivalry. So was internal rivalry the strongest force or the threat of a substitute? So in this particular case, the threat of a substitute was the major force. So companies like Fuji and Kodak had to figure out how to deal with that substitute. And as we all know, this prompted their move into digital photography. So now if you buy a Kodak, it's more likely that that Kodak is a digital camera. Okay, so what's the key takeaway from this slide? That the company needs to figure out which are the strongest forces in its industry. And what does an analyst need to figure out? So when he's analyzing a given industry, what are the strongest forces and which are the companies that are dealing best with those forces? Okay, now let's get into the 5 forces. The first of the 5 forces is the threat of new entrants. This is different from substitutes, right? This is an actual new company coming in. So with new entrants, there is new competition, more capacity, lower margins and returns. So new entrants, why does a new entrant come in? There can be many reasons. And this is perhaps the most dangerous reason. Say you are in the bottled water business and Pepsi comes into the business. Why? Because from Pepsi's perspective, they are diversifying. People are becoming more health conscious, drinking less colas, so they enter into the bottled water business. Why is this so dangerous for you, maybe the established bottled water supplier? Because Pepsi has probably a lot more money, resources, distribution channels, relationships, so that can really impact the industry. Okay, so what's the relevance from a security analyst perspective? When you are analyzing a given industry, you need to figure out what are the chances that other players will come into this industry. And how do you think you do that analysis? The likelihood of others entering an industry is based on the barriers to entry for that business. Okay, so most of the analysis that you will do here will be around what are the barriers to entry. Now, most people have just studied barriers to entry and moved on. The detail that you see here is that there are 7 barriers to entry. How many people knew that? Okay, so now we need to understand these 7 barriers to entry. Give it a quick read. There is a slide or one slide for 2 or 3 of these barriers. Just pay attention, capture this material in your head now so you don't have to do the long reading. Okay, so one barrier is supply side economies of scale. I'm just going to zero in on the core points. Okay, this is straightforward. So scale economies deter competition by requiring large investment. So core point is, let's take the microprocessor industry. So the 2 major players, Intel and say AMD, huge investment required to set up a microprocessor plant. So that gives economies of scale. It's hard for other players to enter into that market. Okay. Next is demand side benefits of scale or network effects. This arises in industries where the buyer's willingness to pay for a company's product increases with the number of other customers who already patronize the company. So if you are a company like IBM in the 80s, for example, you sell computers to the corporate sector. If 80% of the corporate sector buys IBM, okay, then imagine the CIO or the head of IT. Would he want to take a risk and buy from some other company? No. If he buys an IBM and the IBM machine fails, what can he say to his boss? That everybody else is buying IBM, I just bought it. On the other hand, if he takes a risk and buys from some other company, okay, it's generally not safe for him to take that risk, because if things don't work well, he might get fired. So the point here is IBM sort of created or was fortunate enough to create a high entry barrier because it had lots of customers, and that makes it difficult for customers to go somewhere else. A better or a different example is eBay and effectively the network effect. So I hope everybody knows that eBay is a place where you can, it's probably the largest auction in the world, online auction, so you can buy and sell goods on eBay. The utility of eBay is based on how many customers it has. It's probably not hard to set up another platform that technically does the same thing as eBay, but will anybody go there? No, because you already have 1 billion people on eBay. So eBay has effectively created a huge barrier to entry, which is based on a network effect. It's based on a large number of customers, which makes it difficult for customers to go somewhere else. Okay. High switching costs. So if you set up a barrier such that it's very hard to switch, for example, if a company implements SAP, okay, those who have had any exposure to this sort of stuff know how hard it is to go from one ERP or one large computer system to another. Probably not safe to use ERP in this context, but so from one large computer system to another. So high switching cost, that creates barriers to entry. Capital requirements, so barrier is particularly high if the capital required for unrecoverable, if the capital is required for unrecoverable and therefore hard to finance expenditures. So, for example, in the pharmaceutical business, to come up with a successful drug, you need an immense amount of R&D. Okay, once you have that drug, then you can sell it. So, does that create a barrier to entry for new pharma companies? It does. So, this might be one reason why typically pharma companies tend to be more profitable. This force threat of new entrants is generally weak. Okay, incumbency advantage independent of size. The best example here would be if you have patents and copyrights. Okay, you are small, but you have a patent on a given drug. Does that keep new entrants out? It does. So that's another example. Unequal access to distribution channels. Let's say that you are, let's take 2 or 3 top detergents in our country. So you might have, say, Bright and Surf. So let's say these 2 players already claim the major shelf space at grocery stores. Is it easy for a new player with, say, a good product to come into the market? Very hard. So access to distribution channel is also important. And finally, restrictive government policy. So this is roughly like what you studied with monopolies. So if the government has only given, say, cell phone or rights to certain airlines and certain telecom companies, this also creates a barrier to entry. Expected retaliation. If newcomers feel that there will be a major retaliation from the incumbents, does that discourage them from coming in? So that also discourages. Why? Because newcomers will know that when they come in, there will be retaliation, prices will be down, so there will be losses, and hence no point entering. This is homework. Everything I've said so far is just basic stuff. I want you to read box 1. I'll just, I think a safe strategy for doing this reading is to listen to the slides or read the slides or listen to this lecture and read the 4 boxes that are part of this reading. Okay, next, force number 2, the bargaining power of suppliers. So powerful suppliers, including labor, can capture more value for themselves by charging higher prices, limiting quality of services, or shifting costs to industry participants. The key point here is, if you are in an industry where the suppliers are very strong, what will they do to you? They will negotiate with you and they will sell you product at a high price. Okay, if the suppliers are strong. Okay, how do you figure out whether suppliers are strong in a given industry? From an exam question standpoint, this is important. If the supplier is more concentrated than the industry it sells to. The classic example is Microsoft. Microsoft supplies operating systems to the laptop and PC manufacturers. How many laptop and PC manufacturers do you know? Quite a few. How many suppliers of operating systems do you know? Very few. Okay. So 99%, or I don't know, some 90% of the world uses Microsoft's operating system. So do you think Microsoft has some power over here? Okay, so I just bought this laptop for about $400, and then when I tried to buy Windows and Office, I paid $300 for Windows and Office. So who is the powerful player over here? The supplier. Okay, the supplier is not dependent on a single industry. So the supplier Microsoft is not necessarily dependent to just one industry. Industry faces high switching costs. So this means that here we are, remember we are talking about the industry we are evaluating, we are looking at how powerful the suppliers are. Let's say that the industry faces high switching costs. The point here is, let's say that you are the brokerage firm in this context and your supplier is Bloomberg. Okay, so is it easy to just get rid of Bloomberg terminals and bring some other terminal? It's not. So if it is hard to get rid of your supplier because the switching cost is high, that means the supplier has power. Suppliers offer differentiated products. So if suppliers offer products that others cannot offer, that gives them more power. If in your dealing with suppliers you don't have any substitutes, that gives the suppliers more power. If the supplier can threaten to integrate forward into the industry, so if the supplier can just threaten to eat you up or eat up other players or sort of acquire them, does that give suppliers power? Yeah, so basically you need to remember these 6 or 7 bullet points as items that give suppliers more power. The reason I say this is important, on an exam you'll be given a case and you will be asked to figure out which forces are strong. So to figure out whether the suppliers are strong or not, you look at these bullets. Okay. The bargaining power of buyers, again from an exam perspective, you need to memorize or try to remember the main points. Just off the top of your heads, what do you think will be a main theme again? How do buyers become powerful?
There are more buyers.
No, actually, if there are few buyers. Okay, so if for example there are lots of sellers and only one company buying from them, the more concentrated an industry, the more powerful it is. Okay, so if there are lots of people selling, let's say, a given product, lots of companies selling a product, but just one customer, does the buyer have power? Yeah, so clearly the buyer. So few large buyers relative to the size of a single vendor, that gives buyer power. Products are standardized or undifferentiated. So all the companies in your industry are selling more or less the same product, a commodity product. What does that do for the customer? The customer can then just play all the suppliers against each other, and that gives the customer more power. Low switching costs. So from the customer perspective, if you can easily switch from one to another, that gives the customer more power. Buyers or the customer can credibly threaten backward integration. So if the customer can just buy you or other companies in your industry, that also gives the customer or the buyer more power. So again, these points are critical in terms of figuring out whether buyer power is strong in the industry that you are analyzing. All right. A buyer group is price sensitive. If any of these hold, again, in a given industry, let's say that you are one of the CEOs of a company in an industry, would you like to be in an industry where your customers are price sensitive or not? So you are evaluating this industry. Here are the customers. Okay, so if you are in this industry, either as a CEO or trying to analyze this industry, would you be happier if customers are price sensitive, or would you be happier if customers are not price sensitive? Yeah, you obviously, so you don't want the customers to be price sensitive. So isn't it fair that one part of your analysis is to determine whether the customers of that industry are price sensitive or not? So you want to do that analysis. Then the next question becomes, how do you figure out whether customers are price sensitive or not? And the answer is in these three main bullets. If the product represents a large part of the cost or budget, so the product that you sell to your customer represents a major input of 50% of the cost of this customer, will he be price sensitive? He'll be price sensitive. Buyer group has low profitability. So this customer of yours is not very profitable. Then what will happen? Again, I have experience with this. So I worked for some time in the auto industry in the US. So there you have OEMs, tier one, you have companies like Ford, GM, which are the customers. They buy from what's called tier one suppliers. The profitability of automakers in the US is very low. They buy from tier one suppliers, and the tier one suppliers represent a major cost. Okay, now if the margins in the auto industry are very tight, what will they do to their suppliers? They will squeeze every ounce out of their suppliers. So this is not, from an investment perspective, not a great industry to be in if the customers are very price sensitive and squeezing this industry on price. If the quality of input has little effect on the quality of input product has little effect on the buyer's product, okay, so that's a less of an issue. I'd focus on these two. Next force, the threat of substitutes. So threat of substitute products is high if the substitute offers an attractive price performance trade-off to the industry's product. Classic example that most of us are familiar with. So your telecom companies, companies in the US like AT&T and so on. So what happens when Skype comes in? Okay, what do you think has happened to long distance phone bills? From consumer perspective, it's great. We can just Skype over the internet. From the perspective of the telecom companies that used to make a lot of money on, say, long distance calls, obviously that's a problem. So companies have to figure out, in this industry, have to figure out how to deal with these substitutes. The threat of substitute is high if the buyer cost of switching to a substitute is low. What's the cost of us as consumers switching to Skype over our phone? Once we have our computer and our internet connection, the cost is very low. So as an industry that is being hurt by this needs to figure out how to respond. Okay. Technological changes can result in new substitutes impacting the industry's profitability. That's a given. Okay. Rivalry among existing competitors. So this is the final point. Rivalry can take many forms. Example, price discounting. So rivals can undercut prices, or they can be introducing new products, doing more advertising campaigns, spending more money on improving services, and so on. Okay, degree of rivalry depends on its intensity and basis. Okay, now here you need to, again, these are the key bullets here. When you are given a case, you need to figure out whether this force is strong or not. And how do you figure out whether the force is strong or not? Some obvious items. If there are lots of competitors, okay, which are roughly equal size and power, take the telecom industry in Pakistan, so Mobilink and whatever, Ufone, Zong, etc., roughly equally powerful, so immense rivalry. Industry growth is slow, so they are competing with each other for market share. Exit barriers high. Why would this impact rivalry? Rehan? Yeah, if you cannot easily get out of a business, then you might reduce your prices more. So in any business where companies are willing to reduce prices to gain market share, the rivalry will be higher. If it is easy to get out of a business, then rather than trying to fight with your competitors, you will just get out. Okay, if for whatever reason the various rivals in the business have a commitment to that industry or that business, that again will create more rivalry. So these bullets from a testability perspective are very important. The basis of competition can have different dimensions, example, price, service, quality, etc. Okay. Rivalry based purely on price is the most destructive to profitability. So if you see players in the industry all competing based on price, that should really concern you, because the profitability of that industry will be weak. Okay, price competition is more likely to occur. Again, you should see the trend over here. These are the key points. Little product differentiation, if switching costs are low, fixed costs are high, marginal costs are low, capacity can be expanded in large increments. So if a company has just done a huge capacity expansion, okay, will it want to then exit the industry? No. It will just compete real hard to gain as much market share. It might offer price discounts and so on. If the product being sold is perishable, that again will increase competition. So obvious things. That's why I don't think you need to spend too much time on this. Just if you go through these slides, that should be good enough. Now we will talk about certain factors that are often confused for forces, but they are not really forces. So it's important to avoid the common pitfall of making certain visible attributes of an industry or mistaking certain visible attributes of an industry for its underlying structure. So when we say underlying structure of an industry, we are looking at the 5 forces. Okay. Now there are other areas which are really called factors. These include industry growth rate, technology and innovation, government, and complementary products and services. So let's go through this. A common misconception might be that you say a given industry has a fast growth rate, therefore it is a good industry to invest. Is that logical? It might seem logical at first, but are you investing in an industry because the industry is going fast, or are you investing in an industry because you think the value of your investment will go up? You are concerned about the value of your investment. Do you think your value of the investment depends more on the profitability of the industry or the growth of the industry? What really matters is profitability, and this whole industry analysis is after profitability. So just because a firm, a company, an industry is growing fast, does that mean it will be profitable? Not necessarily. For example, you can have a high growth industry, but most of the premium or most of the benefit is captured by the supplier. A good example would be PC manufacturing. So over the 90s, the industry grew a lot in terms of size, but was it becoming more and more profitable? No. The supplier, Microsoft, made a ton of money, but the industry itself fast growing but not profitable. You are concerned with profitability. And the key point here is you need to keep looking at the 5 forces. So a industry might be growing fast, but if the forces are strong, then the profitability will be low. Okay. What about technology and innovation? Again, a common misconception that high-tech industries will be more profitable. Is that necessarily true? No. Advanced technology or innovations per se do not make an industry attractive. You can have low-tech industries with price-insensitive buyers, high switching costs, or high entry barriers of scale, etc., or high entry barriers of scale economies can be more profitable than software and internet industries. So the key point is that you can also have low-tech companies that are more profitable as long as there are price-insensitive buyers, high switching costs, etc. Okay. Government. A lot of people consider the role of government as critical in the industry. Now, while that is true, but what Michael Porter says is that the best way is to analyze how specific government policies will affect the 5 competitive forces. So, for example, if in a country like France, there are lots of pro-union labor laws, how does that impact the 5 forces? Okay, there will be high bargaining power of suppliers. All right. Okay, what about bankruptcy laws? So weak companies survive, and this may lead to excess capacity. All right. So key point is to look at it in the context of what government rule and how is that government rule or policy impacting the 5 forces. Next, complementary products and services. This is interesting. So everybody recalls from economics what a complement is. So these are complements that are used together with the industry's product. Again, the best way to evaluate complements is the impact on the 5 forces. So complements, for example, may either raise or lower barriers to entry. You need to be careful in your analysis what's going on. So one example or situation is that Microsoft, let's consider the software application business. So these are small applications that, for example, to manage inventory or do stuff like that on your computer. Microsoft produces application tool sets which makes it easier to make these software applications. So this is a complement. Because of this complement, it becomes easier for other players to enter the application business. All right, so that is lowering a barrier to entry. Another scenario is, let's say you are evaluating the video game hardware business. If you are in the video game hardware business and your complement then is what? The video games. So in this particular case, if on your hardware platform there are lots of suppliers or lots of entities that are making video games for your platform, what does that do to barriers to entry? That raises the barriers to entry. So the key point is, when there are complements to an industry, you have to drill in and see, is that complement raising the barrier or lowering the barrier to entry? Okay, another example to deal with the threat of substitutes. This is a somewhat US-centric example, but you might know that there is a big push to get energy efficient cars, for example, that run on alternative fuel sources. Okay, now the need for fueling stations makes it difficult for alternative fuels to substitute for conventional fuel in cars. Okay, so you are evaluating this regular conventional fuel market. So what's the complement to conventional fuel? Your regular cars. Okay, now because of this strong complement, most people are driving regular cars. So the need for fueling stations makes it difficult for alternative fuels. So you can't just bring in alternative fuels because of the strong link between conventional fuels and cars. Okay, section 4, changes in industry structure, and I am going to just read out the core points that you need to know. So far we have discussed the competitive forces at a single point in time. Industry structure proves to be relatively stable, and industry profitability differences are remarkably persistent over time in practice. However, industry structure is constantly undergoing modest adjustment, and occasionally it can change abruptly. The key point for an analyst here is to understand the industry structure and figure out what's changing, what's not changing, and if there are abrupt changes, you need to be in place to take advantage of that. So what we are going to look at is the 5 forces and potential changes. So for example, the threat of entry, new players, this is one of the forces. So changes, so to evaluate whether new players can enter the industry, what do you look at? You look at the barriers to entry, and you look at, are those barriers changing or not? Okay, for example, changes to any of the 7 barriers described previously can raise or lower the threat of entry. For example, one example of a barrier was things like a patent. So Merck had some major drugs which were protected from competition because of the patent. A smart analyst who is following the pharmaceutical industry will know which drug, which patent, and when is that patent expiring. What will happen the moment the patent expires? Then you will have generic drugs coming into the market. So clearly, when the patent expires, what happens to the barrier to entry? It comes down, and there is the threat of new entry immediately goes up. Okay, so changing supplier or buyer power, and again this is another US centric example, but I think very interesting. So the key point here is your supplier or buyer power changing? And the example here is, let's take the appliance industry, and the major players, at least at the time this paper was written, the major players in the appliance industry, by appliance industry we mean things like washing machines, fridges, etc., called white goods also. So GE, Whirlpool, etc. are the major players. Okay. Now, how was the buyer power changing? Let's say until in the 1960s and 70s, these companies had a lot of power because they sold to, let's say, small outlets. So I'll just give you an example. So let's say you have companies like GE, Whirlpool. So this is your industry. Now, if this industry is selling to lots of small stores, okay, so you have, let's say, tons of small stores that are outlets for GE, Whirlpool, etc. In this scenario, who has more power, the GEs or these small players? GE, Whirlpool, etc. have more power. But then in the 80s and 90s, there was a consolidation of these entities. So if your retail outlets start consolidating and you have entities such as Best Buy, or actually this is more electronics, let's say you have entities like Circuit City and so on, but effectively if your buyers are consolidating and you have few large, so this consolidation of retail chains, so these retail chains consolidate, these entities, let's say there are two main outlets through which GE and Whirlpool can sell. What's happening to this industry now? The power is shifting to the buyer. When the power is shifting to the buyer, what's the likely impact on the profitability of GE, Whirlpool, etc.? The profitability is coming down. So a smart analyst will see these changes happening in a industry. And this is actually a larger point. You will notice that at least in many places today, you have industry-specific analysts, because when you have industry-specific analysts, they have a much better view, or they can study changes like this much better than, say, a generalist. Okay. Similarly, the shifting threat or substitution, the most common reason substitutes become more or less threatening over time is that advances in technology create new substitutes or shift price performance comparison, etc. So Skype is a great example. So it's technology that's enabled that substitute. New bases of rivalry. Rivalry often intensifies naturally over time. As an industry matures, growth slows, competitors become more alike. As industry conventions emerge, technology diffuses, and customers' tastes converge. So all this is saying is that what you are looking for is that when an industry matures, by that time everybody is sort of zeroing in on similar products. Customers are also used to those products. So now it is harder for companies to differentiate on the product. So then what do? Then they start competing on price. And what will that do to profitability? Profitability down. Okay. Now, after 4 sections where this reading is basically a general reading targeted at any strategy person, I think this is one paragraph that talks about analysts. So understanding the forces that shape industry competition is the starting point for developing strategy. Every company should already know what the average profitability of its industry and how that has been changing over time. The 5 forces reveal why industry profitability is what it is. Only then can a company incorporate industry conditions into strategy. Okay, so basically the key point is understanding those forces allows you to understand why the profitability is what it is. Then the question is, given your understanding of the industry forces, the best strategies exploit more than one of the following possibilities. Either you reposition your company, or you exploit the industry change, or you somehow change the or shape the industry structure. What are examples? Positioning the company. So analysis of the 5 forces reveals what your positioning opportunity is. Go back to my example on Packard in the truck business. So what did Packard realize? They realized that the buyer power is very strong. So what did they then do? They repositioned themselves and found new customers. Customers So for Packard, if Packard's customer is a whole range of private buyers, individual buyers, then what does that do to Packard's power? So if I am Packard and now my customer is John Doe and Peter Smith and so on, don't I have more power? Because the consumers are not going to have as much bargaining power as large corporates. Okay, so in a sense, Packard repositioned itself and managed to increase its profitability. Okay, so that's a good example. Exploiting industry change. So this is another good one. When industry structure is in flux, new and promising competitive positions may appear. Structural changes open up new needs and new ways to serve existing needs. And smaller companies are better placed to capitalize on industry changes. So here a classic example is the music industry with digital music and the ability to copy music. What happened? There was lots of piracy. So some large music labels tried to create their own proprietary platforms. But if I am EMI, will a rival music company want to create anything for my platform? No. So who stepped into this vacuum? Apple. So Apple, with its iTunes and the Apple Store and so on, managed to become a neutral technology platform that began servicing all the major music labels. So change in industry, and a company like Apple exploited it. And I hope some of you might know that over the last few years, Apple's market capitalization has been going through the roof. Okay, so who would have imagined 20 years ago that Apple would be a major player in the music industry? Okay, shaping the industry, this is not too difficult. So when you recognize the forces in your industry, the major players in the industry can try and change that industry. For example, in a given industry, let's say supplier power is strong. One of the things that the industry can start doing maybe is standardizing, so that all your so you just have one standard that all our suppliers should provide based on this standard. If you standardize, what will that do to supplier power? That actually reduces the supplier power. So the rest you can read over here. The examples are fairly straightforward, but the key point is that you can sometimes, the players in our industry can effectively reshape the industry to try and boost the profits of that industry. Okay. Competition and value, actually this is the point where we talk about investors and analysis. Understanding the industry structure is equally important for investors as for managers. The 5 competitive forces reveal whether an industry is truly attractive, and they help investors anticipate positive or negative shifts in industry structure before they are obvious. The 5 forces distinguish short-term blips from structural changes and allow investors to take advantage of undue pessimism or optimism. Those companies whose strategies have industry transforming potential become far clearer. This deeper thinking about competition is a more powerful way to achieve genuine investment success than the financial projections and trend extrapolation that dominate today's investment analysis. So this is Michael Porter's 2 cents worth on how to be a successful investor. Actually, it's more than 2 cents worth when Michael Porter says it. Okay, this is pretty powerful. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this reading. Your homework is to read the 4 boxes. One box that I've given you an excerpt of earlier. Read box 2, 3, and 4.